sisters, brothers, let us love one another.
I'd like to dedicate this episode of Pathos Metamorphos to a couple of good folks. One, Bryce Johnson. He's a friend of mine, and I've known him since college days, the University of Minnesota. We both were involved with Campus Crusade, now known as Crew, which, by the way, my son Noah has also been involved with that group in his college days. He's now in his doctorate studies at New York Medical, but he was involved with Crew at Rutgers and Raritan Valley Community College before that. Anyway, Bryce, he fairly recently, I believe it was probably late November, early December, had it diagnosed as the metastatic carcinoma. So pray for Bryce and pray for his family that they would determine with this next generation sequencing test, which I believe has either happened or will happen soon, to determine the source of that cancer. And pray for comfort and peace for Bryce and his family. And Bryce, we're thinking about you, praying for you, and wishing you well. I also dedicate this show to David Guy. He is a fellow graduate of Wayzata High School, class of 1989. He and his wife have a Caring Bridge site, and he's got a type of cancer called paraganglioma. Hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, but it's a type of neuroendocrine it's tumor, but a form of cancer. And so he's got quite an inspiring story on his Caring Bridge site. If I ever get a chance, I'm going to link to these things. But again, dedicate the show to those good folks, and just wish them well. And anybody out there that's a praying kind, please pray for them, for their encouragement, and for their their healing and their overall well-being. Thank you very much. Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 4 of Pathos Metamorphos. Hope everyone is having a great holiday season. We're now in the midst of the limbo between Christmas and New Year's, what the British call Crimbo, and my friend Mike Rowe calls it that as well. Crimbo speaks more of the secular and commercial aspects of the Christmas season in the UK. By the way, Mike Rowe and fellow 77's band members Mark Harmon and Bruce Spencer have a release of Christmas songs. It's definitely one of my favorite Christmas recordings. It's called Happy Crimbo. It was released about 20 years or so now, back then. And it's only 7 tunes with a running time of close to 22 minutes. Includes one of my favorite Christmas songs, Run, Rudolph, Run, by Chuck Berry, and it's a great version of that song. Mike Rowe is really rocking out on that one and doing those great Chuck Berry inspired or Chuck Berry riffs, and just great tune, great version of it, and a lot of other great Christmas songs. So I highly recommend you look that up. You can find it on Bandcamp. I've been meaning to link. I didn't do that for the last episode, and I still have to go back and listen to it and maybe put links to it because I had promised to do so and haven't done so yet. I'll try to put some links up on this one as well, on I guess what we'll call the show notes page on the YouTube channel. So what do I want to talk about this time around? Well, we celebrated Christmas, and at Christmas, for at least those who are followers of Christ, it's celebrated as the birth of Jesus. And it's really not probably arguably the most important Christian holiday, because the the more important is Easter, which is where the fulfillment of what Christ came to do happened. The resurrection, his Christ's death, burial, and resurrection happened on Easter. But at Christmas, and with the advent of Christ's coming, and of course, as we're living right now between what I'll talk about between the now and the not yet, we're also in Advent looking forward to Christ's return, or his appearing, or his second coming, as it's been referred to throughout church history. So I want to talk about a bit of that. So I'm going to be talking a bit more about dualism, which we covered which we didn't really cover. I mean, you can never really fully cover it because there's just so much to talk about there. And I want to talk about eschatology, which is a big theological word, which really is the study of last things, or the consummation of all things, as it's been called. So we'll get into that. So I think I mentioned Aristotle in the last episode. I want to mention Plato. He was another big philosopher and thinker. And a lot of his ideas have been basically inculcated and adopted by Christians over the years, and it's been assimilated without really much thought. It's so embedded in our beliefs, or even just underneath the surface of our beliefs. We don't really question it. So an example of this is the whole duality thing with body and soul. This duality is again a Platonic idea and not a biblical one. So the idea is that the body and the things associated with the body, like you could think of our fleshly sins, or even sexuality and things like that related to the body, that's evil. And that so the body is bad and mortal, and the soul, the non-physical, our spiritual being, as it's often posed as, is good and eternal. So again, it's this duality of body and soul, and that creeps into our theology, where our soul goes to heaven. That sort of thinking. Just want to mention that the Bible talks about the body being a gift from God. For example, just one of many examples. Paul in Galatians 2:20, the second half of that verse says, "The life I live in the body, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me." To be sure, there are, in the Bible it talks about the flesh, that, there are sins of the flesh, that are committed by the body. But the body inherently is a gift and is created by God, and we were created in God's image, and we were created in bodily form. And Jesus came in bodily form, and he resurrected in bodily form. And I want to just kind of get into that a little bit here too. And so the Christian's ultimate hope is in a bodily resurrection, of which Jesus was the first fruits. And that's what the Bible calls, which has a meaning in the biblical definition, that just as Jesus had a bodily resurrection, so will we as followers of Christ. And heaven, or paradise, as Jesus called it when he was on the cross, and one of the thieves next to him, said, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." And Jesus said, "Truly I say to you, you will be with me in paradise." So when we talk about that, it's not our ultimate destination and hope. And this is the misconception, and this is what I really just wanted to kind of clear up, because this is very fuzzy. It's been very fuzzy to me as well, until very recently, because I recently, and I'm almost finished with it, finally, I've been reading a book by N.T. Wright, or Tom Wright, as he's more familiarly known as by I guess his friends. This is a wonderful book that very verbose, like a lot of his books, but it contains such great information, and I commend it to you. Anybody really in the Christian faith that's sort of nebulous on the idea of heaven, eschatology. So the what do you call it? The underneath the title it says, or the subtitle is "Rethinking Heaven, the Resurrection, and the Mission of the Church." So I want to talk a bit about this. Ideas driven by this book and other things. So when I was talking about, we know that we talk about being in heaven and paradise when we die. We know that if we die, according to the Christian faith, before bodily resurrection, we will be with the Lord. As Paul says, to be absent from the body, it's to be present with the Lord. And his conundrum that he speaks of in one of his letters is that, he would prefer to be with Christ because that's far better. But as long as he remains in the body on earth, that's good because he can do fruitful work for the Lord. So we know that if we die before that bodily resurrection, we will be with the Lord, what the Bible euphemistically calls being asleep in many places. So we will be at peace, to be sure, at that time, and it is a great hope that to be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord. However, that is not the end of the matter, and as Stephen Covey says, I think it's in a book called 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, if I'm not mistaken. He says one of the 7 habits or principles is to begin with the end in mind. So our view of the end, or what we might call again the consummation of all things, will affect our view of the here and now. So what will ultimately happen in terms of last things, and this is called eschatology, and that will impact how we live today. The origin of the word eschatology comes from the Greek of eschatos, which means last, and then the logy, the low G at the end, is the study of a certain subject. So you could think of it as a study of last things, or again, the consummation of all things. And again, I want to become clearer on this, since I think the idea of what happens after physical death is very fuzzy to many of us, whether you're inside the Christian faith or you're outside of it. It's evidenced by, what's said at funerals and things like that. There's often things that are said which are not really biblical at all. Anyway, just want to kind of try to draw that out, make that clear, because I think, our view of what happens in the end really, again, impacts how we live or here and now. So the biblical teaching is that at Jesus' appearing, what we call the second coming, heaven and earth will be united. There will be a new heavens and a new earth, as it talks about in Revelation, book of Revelation. The idea of the rapture comes from the English words snatched away, which Paul uses in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verses 13 through 18. It talks about that. And that idea of being raptured or snatched away is relatively recent and was only largely formalized in the 19th century in in the Western world, I believe in the United States, primarily by John Nelson Darby. Of course, it continues to remain popular today, as evidenced by the Left Behind series in the 90s and aughts, as well as the 70s by Hal Lindsey's late great Planet Earth book. The idea is that Christians will be snatched away from this earth and taken home to heaven. And implied in this is that everything down here on earth is going to burn. And God's going to take us home to heaven, to heavenly glory, away from this mess down here on earth. Again, for those with eyes to see and with ears to hear, we could see the false binary Platonic dualism of earth, bad, and heaven, good. Well, moving on. The primary verses used as evidence of the rapture, again, are 1 Thessalonians 4:13 through 18. I think I'll find that and read it here real quick. Should have had this ready, sorry. But I do not want you to be ignorant, brethren, concerning those who have fallen asleep. Again, there's the euphemism for being dead. Lest you sorrow as others who have no hope. For if we believe that Jesus died and rose again, even so God will bring with him those who sleep in Jesus. For this we say to you by the word of the Lord, that we who are alive and remain until the coming of the Lord will by no means precede those who are asleep. For the Lord himself will descend from heaven with a shout, with the voice of an archangel, and with the trumpet of God, and the dead in Christ will rise first. Then we who are alive and remain shall be caught up together with him in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air, and thus we shall always be with the Lord. Therefore comfort one another with these words. And it goes on to up to verses 10 and 11 of chapter 5, where Paul is speaking on this subject. Because again, when the letters were written, they didn't have chapters and verses like we have them today. It was kind of a complete thought by Paul. And I'm just going to, I have some notes here, and I'm reading from many of them here. So I wanted to just stress that we have to remember that Paul's letters were part of a dialogue, two-way communication, which we only have the written record of Paul writing to these churches in these various letters that are included in the New Testament. In the book of 1 Thessalonians that Paul wrote to the Thessalonican congregation, we have a context. Again, there had been some communication. Paul had visited Thessalonica, and there were some concerns or thoughts that the believers had there. And so Paul is addressing those, and we'll talk about what that is here. So Paul's letters in general included great teaching that were contextual, again, in terms of the relationship he had with those areas and churches. The encouragement from Paul being offered in the text that I just read, all the way, and again, it continues up through verses 10 and 11, chapter 5, the encouragement is that those who already died would not be excluded from the glory which those found alive would share. The believers, this is the context here, were grieving over unexpected deaths of church members, and this is according to 1 Thessalonians 4:13, which we read in the Bible. And and you can sort of conjecture what the concern was from the believers, and it's explicitly stated there in the text as well. So from the commentary on the whole Bible by Jameson, Fawcett, and Brown, it's observed that, and I quote, the leading topic of Paul's preaching at Thessalonica having been the coming kingdom, which, if you go to the book of Acts in chapter 17, verse 7, you can read about that. Some perverted it into a cause for fear in respect to friends lately deceased, as if these would be excluded from the glory which those found alive alone should share. This error Paul here corrects. End of quote. So, whether living or dead, we will live together with Christ, as Paul communicates in chapter 5, verses 10 and 11 of 1 Thessalonians, where he says, For God did not appoint us to wrath, but to obtain salvation through our Lord Jesus Christ, who died for us, that whether we wake or sleep, we should live together with him. Therefore, comfort each other and edify one another with these words. Well, I added with these words, but comfort and edify one another just as you also are doing. So Paul's exhortation, encouragement there is to comfort the Thessalonians, in that, hey, whether you're alive, whether you're dead, you're going to be with Christ at his return. Okay, moving along here. So having dispensed talking about rapture theology, what does the Bible clearly say about last things? Well, we have a new heaven and a new earth to look forward to. It's in the words of the Lord's Prayer as well. The prayer that when the disciples asked, Lord, how should we pray? Jesus gave the Lord's Prayer, which we know the words of. And some of those words are, your kingdom come, your will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. So again, I want to stress there, I'm stressing the on earth as it is in heaven part. So how we live now is of ultimate importance. We are caretakers of this earth in the present, that's the now, and one day God will set all things straight. He will set the world to rights. That's the not yet. So we are living between the now and the not yet right now. However, we can take great comfort in knowing that God's justice is coming. And we, as his ambassadors, get to share the good news with the world. That's the good news of Jesus, who came to free the sinners from their sin. That's indeed good news for all of us, because we're all sinners. And this gospel includes good news for the poor, sight to the blind, and setting free the oppressed. I want to just read Jesus' words that when he announced his ministry in Luke chapter 4, as we now know it, verses 16 to 21. So he being Jesus, came to Nazareth where he'd been brought up. And as his custom was, he went into the synagogue on the Sabbath day and stood up to read. And he was handed the book of the prophet Isaiah. It's a scroll. And when he had opened the book, he found the place where it was written. And he chose to read this part of Isaiah. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He has sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed, to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord. Then he closed the book and gave it back to the attendant and sat down. And the eyes of all who were in the synagogue were fixed on him. And he began to say to them, today this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing. And you can imagine the response. A lot of them were taken and were marveling at his words. And they proceeded to say, isn't this Joseph's son? Don't we know him? Don't we know his family? And eventually it ends up that they're ready to throw him over the cliff, because Jesus is saying, no prophet is accepted in his hometown. And he was, giving some examples from from what we call the Old Testament of that, because they're grumbling about, hey, isn't this, Joseph's son? We know who his parents are. Who does he think he is? That kind of thing. Anyway, we see here, we don't have to choose between evangelism and, doing good in the neighborhood, or what we might call the social gospel. By the way, I'll try to buzz myself when I use buzzwords like that. Social gospel, I think this is probably one of them. Maybe not, but it's one of the things I'll try and do along the way here. So again, that's that dualistic thinking, again, rearing its ugly and very Platonic Western head, again, trying to have us make a false binary choice. It's not either or, it's both and. Loving our neighbor means we care about justice for the oppressed and that good news for the poor, just as Jesus did when he announced his ministry in Luke 4. When he chose that text in Isaiah to read that talks about those things. With our gifts, what we call our spiritual gifts, some may be gifted as evangelists. Some may even have gifts. Some may be gifted in hospitality or in ways that bring about a just world as God intended it to be. Some may even have gifts that span both sides of that unfortunate dualistic coin we in the Western world think we need to choose between. One which we call evangelism, or saving souls. Save those souls, because this world is going to perish, it's going to burn, and we don't care. The world's going to hell in a handbasket, and we don't care about that. We just want to get take as many with us to heaven as we can. So that's often viewed as the one and only form of outreach we should do as followers of Christ, or primary. And again, contrasted, again, we had that duality, the social gospel, which is generally shunned, at least among some in the evangelical context, as being less important. However, all of these good gifts are needed. The good news of the gospel is not separate from love for our neighbor in these ways of serving our neighbors. And I want to talk about some of these things as we go along in the various podcasts. So the outworking of all these gifts are necessary in the body of Christ for it to function well in the world in which we live. We mentioned briefly about how some words like snatched away, for example, in English led to a whole theology, which really, as I mentioned before, has done a disservice, or as I implied, I guess, it's done as a disservice to the outworking of Christian behavior. Again, the implication being it's all going to burn anyway. Why do we need to care for the world? All we need to do is try to save souls and take as many with us to heaven. And it's a very separatist. You can see how that sort of thinking is a very separatist thinking. And it's not inclusive of the world who Jesus came to save. And that's his desire. God's desire throughout the Bible is that all would come to know him. And God sent Jesus, his son, to accomplish that work, that we would all come to know him and all have forgiveness of sins. We've all fallen short of the glory of God, to be sure, and that's why we need his forgiveness, and we need to receive that. So speaking of such etymological misunderstandings of that snatched away rapture thing, I heard mentioned recently on the Holy Post podcast, which is another podcast I highly recommend, that the word sorcery was the fastest growing search term on Bible Gateway in 2021. And by the way, I'm also taking from, which the Holy Post podcast took from as well, religionnews.com article on December 2nd, 2021. If you search up that date on religionnews.com or search up the word sorcery, you'll find this article. So again, sorcery was the fastest growing search term in 2021 on Bible Gateway. And why is that? Well, the Greek word for sorcery is pharmakeia, and you can see, the pharma in there, Pharma. And it's appeared in debates over COVID-19 prevention measures this year, particularly with respect to opposition by some charismatic and evangelical Christians to vaccines against the disease caused by the novel coronavirus. So Vincent, let's see. This was my other page. I guess he scribbled on for my notes.
I didn't scribble on that.
No? Well, who did then? Who did
I
that?
guess someone like that. I guess you did it.
Vincent, are you telling the truth?
I didn't do it.
Who did it?
Seth, you know what?
What?
You know what? I didn't do it.
But Vincent, if I didn't do it and you didn't do it, then who did it?
I guess you did.
Vincent, that's not true.
I
It's okay. I'm not mad at you.
I know it, but I didn't do it.
Oh, well, you need to always tell the truth, right?
I did, but I didn't do it.
We need to talk about this some more because I know I didn't do it.
I know I didn't do it.
Okay. We have something to talk about.
I know who do that. Scribbles.
Well, I came to the end of one page of notes and was looking for the other, and I found writing on it, and Vincent adamantly denied that he did it, but he did do it, and I'm trying to get him to realize the importance of telling the truth. Good object lesson there. So anyway, where was I? I was talking about etymological misunderstandings and talking about the word, Greek word pharmakeia, and basically some kind of magical thinking that's going on with a lot of people, I guess, who are talking about this, and basically that coupled the word, the Greek word pharmakeia, which is a Greek word that carries the idea of sorcery or witchcraft as its primary definition in the Greek. Coupling that with somehow with vaccines for COVID. So kind of using this line of thinking, we should not take any drugs or put any pharmaceutical drugs into our bodies, including the COVID vaccine or any other vaccine or pharmaceutical drug for that matter. But those who tout this sort of thing don't always actually follow that line of thinking to its logical conclusion, as I'm sure many of these people are still taking some kind of pharmaceutical drug. Advil, Tylenol, aspirin, anyone? So this type of misinformation is egregious and very dangerous. Basically what it is lay people taking a Greek word, applying it to a tertiary definition in English, taking the Greek, translating it into English as a tertiary, a third definition, not even the primary definition. And then, we have, basically, and I don't mean to offend anyone, but in the age that we're living in here, we have know-it-all social influencers who basically spout these types of dubious connections between, again, Greek and English words as truth. And we have a very relativistic sort of truth in our day and age, which is a bit ironic because a few years ago in the church, there was a big movement, I think it was called the Truth Project, to basically hold truth to be in high esteem. But basically, we've basically, it seems, truth is as relative to the beholder. And you can have somebody with influence on social media or on the internet say something, and then it's spreads like wildfire, and a lot of people believe that stuff, and it's really unfortunate. So this kind of secret decoding, we were talking about, like with the word pharmakeia, and people dissecting the words and trying to make things out of them which are not there. That kind of secret decoding that many in the church are doing and many are following is very Gnostic. It's Antichrist, and it leads many astray. I want to just talk a little bit about Gnosticism for a moment. It's a sort of a collection of doctrines or belief systems that started late in the first century, and it emphasized personal spiritual knowledge over and above Orthodox Christian teachings. That sounds a lot like what is happening in our society, particularly in the Western society, I believe, in our culture today. And in this day and age of COVID-19 and its variants, this type of thinking has caused many people to die, perhaps when they could have received an antidote. I love all of my Christian brothers and sisters. I love everybody, not just my Christian brothers and sisters, but in this context, I'm including those who believe and spout this dangerous type of thinking. I love all of you. But this thinking needs to be called out for what it is. It's a magical, Gnostic type of thinking that is contrary to Christ. It's antichrist. Let's call it for what it is. And it does great harm. And at its extreme, this misinformation brings death. Well, and there's my son. I hate to end on such a note, but I do have to end it at some point. I hope everyone has a good new year, and I hope everyone stays healthy. Yes, Vincent, you can come in. Take care, everyone. Love you. Bye.